just before his army invaded Ukraine. Vladimir Putin outlined his motivations in a speech. His first and main argument,
имея в виду расширение блока НАТО на восток.
NATO's expansion. He blamed the extensions of the military alliance ever closer to Russia's borders and accused Western leaders of breaking alleged promises to never do so.
В этом ряду и обещание нашей стороне не расширять ни на 1 дюйм НАТО на восток.
But experts disagree on whether that's true.
The U.S. broke these assurances and these commitments that had been made.
I think that's false. It's really sort of a pretext.
So was anything really promised? And why is that such a crucial point for Russia? After World War II, two spheres of influence emerged in Europe, each one with their military alliance. NATO in the west, countries that would soon be part of the Warsaw Pact in the east. This created a clear red line between the two superpowers. Their spheres of influence were clearly defined, and for many years NATO grew slowly. Until 1990, when that divide started to crumble here in Germany.
In Germany was the key focal point of the Cold War in Europe.
Joshua Schifrinson has done extensive archival research on the US and Soviet foreign policy,
including this great question of what or was not promised in 1990.
At the time, Germany was speeding towards reunification. And for many in Europe, this was a bit scary.
The US did not want to see a reunified Germany either in the Soviet camp or neutral, right? And the concern with neutrality was that a neutral Germany might one day run amok.
Washington decided the best option was to bring Germany into NATO. But first, they had to convince the Soviets. And here we get to those famous assurances about NATO's expansion.
And in February of 1990, in a series of meetings, US and West German leaders very openly said that if the Soviet leadership consented to German reunification and reunified Germany remaining in NATO, then NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east.
Logs of those conversations have since been declassified, and they show what Soviet politicians were told by Western leaders like German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, NATO Secretary General Manfred Wörner, and the famous words by US Secretary of State James Baker, not 1 inch to the east. So what happened to NATO after Germany unified? In 1999, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland joined NATO. In 2004, it was the Baltic states and 4 other countries. And finally, 4 more from 2009 to just a few years ago. Georgia and Ukraine were promised membership in 2008, but are not yet members. This seems to justify Putin's grievances, but one historical event could suggest a different interpretation.
Back in 1991, in the collapse of the Soviet Union.
This is Stephen Pfeiffer. He was the US ambassador to Ukraine when NATO was expanding, and deputy director on the Soviet desk when those assurances were made.
When Secretary Baker at that time was talking about NATO not extending forward, I understood that as not into East Germany.
Pfeiffer says that those commitments didn't refer to countries like Poland or Lithuania because...
At that time also, the Warsaw Pact still existed. The Warsaw didn't collapse for another year. So I saw the discussions about not 1 inch really in the context of Germany.
But many experts disagree.
That doesn't quite hold water for 2 different reasons. One is that the Soviet leadership and the Americans both understood that the question of what comes next in Europe was all about the future of Eastern Europe, not just East Germany. There's a concern that the Warsaw Pact is falling apart. And also, if I say to you, I'm not going east, it's a pretty generic statement, right? It kind of beggars the imagination to think that they only meant, east only there, but no further from there.
Pfeiffer, however, raises another point.
When you look at the actual agreements, there were no final commitments by NATO not to enlarge.
In other words, no treaties, only conversations.
Nothing was written down, as we've established. But at the same time, political understandings and commitments of this sort, diplomatic commitments, carry a lot of water in world politics. This is how we ended the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. And if it didn't matter, why would we have diplomats talk to each other?
Regardless of how serious these assurances were, this debate arguably misses a more important point.
States don't uphold treaties just because they're written down. If those leaders in those states decide to change course, then a treaty is not going to stand in the way. So all the emphasis on writing things down, it puts the cart before the horse.
NATO's expansion can be better explained by focusing not on those conversations, but on the countries involved. On one side, the US, whose influence grew after the fall of the Soviet Union.
NATO expansion was fundamentally a byproduct of the unipolar era, right? At this moment in time where the US had great power, very few constraints, and at least some policymakers who had an idea that American power and influence applied to the world would generate lots of goods for the United States as well as good things for the world.
On another, the countries that joined NATO.
It wasn't that NATO said, let's enlarge. It was you had countries such as Poland emerging from the wreckage of the Warsaw Pact saying, we want to be a member of NATO, we want to be a member of the European Union, and we are prepared to do all of the things that requires.
And finally, Russia, whose motivations are not limited to NATO.
I think there are really three reasons behind what Russia is doing. One is the geopolitical concern. The Russians want a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space, and Ukraine is a very important part of that. So they're trying to bring it back. But there are two other issues at play here. One, I think, is a domestic political concern, and that is for the Kremlin, a Western-oriented, democratic, economically successful. That kind of Ukraine is a nightmare for the Kremlin because it leads to Russians asking, why can't we have the same political voice and the same democratic rights that they have in Ukraine? And then there's a third reason, which I just think it's Vladimir Putin. And he's quite emotional about Ukraine. He's very emotional and even angry about it.
Whether NATO should have kept its assurances is up for debate.
We underestimated just how much antipathy there was in Moscow to NATO's existence.
Years of the US downplaying the assurances that were previously given and making Russia feel like it could not trust the West have really narrowed the opportunity to resolve this crisis.
But it's really sort of a pretext. Mr. Putin has put together this list of grievances against the West, but he didn't talk about them 20 years ago.
But those discussions were important not only for what they promised, but also for what they showed. A willingness to compromise and to not cross each other's red lines. Over the years, the situation around Russia changed, and more countries decided to join NATO. But it changed even more within Russia, as Putin's grip on power strengthened, and he became more authoritarian and isolated.